Alex Lifschutz is a co-founder and principal of Lifschutz Davidson Sandilands, who are master planners and architects involved in a series of major housing projects in London, including Kidbrooke Village, Barking Riverside, East Village, and Kilburn Quarter. They head up the delivery team for the Illuminated River project and have recently designed proposals for a ferry to replace Hammersmith Bridge while it undergoes restoration. So, Alex, you've got a long history with the River Thames, going back to your designs for the floating Lido and the Golden Jubilee Bridge. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, I suppose it all started when we began working at Coin Street, which was in the late 80s. And Coin Street had a parcel of land, about 13 acres, on the river at the South Bank. And it was them who inspired us. The first project we did for them was the Oxo Tower. And obviously that started to connect to the water. It had a wooden jetty. King Henry VIII's Large, I think it's called, which was the barge way for him to launch his barge, which he used to ferry himself up and down the river. So we started to become interested in the river, and we met some very interesting folk there who were mudlarking and doing lots of interesting things on the shoreline. And it was they who suggested the project for a floating swimming pool. They'd got consent for something like that in their outline master plan, and we then went on to develop the proposal. We began to become interested in structures that either float in the water or stand in the water. And again, on the South Bank, we did a master plan to try and resolve the very tangled routes from Waterloo Station to the South Bank, to the cultural buildings there. We discovered that many of them, the cultural buildings, the National Theatre, the South Bank Centre, actually, and IPC, blue chip companies like IPC and Shell, ran buses because they couldn't actually get their employees safely from the station to their rather isolated headquarters buildings. So we did a master plan to improve public routes and public access, and then proposed a crossing at Hungerford Bridge, looking at what was there at the time, which was a 2-metre wide footway that had been slung off the railway bridge back in the 1860s. It didn't seem appropriate, respectful to the pedestrian to just rely on that. And so we put forward an idea for improving that crossing, which was then taken up. There was then a competition, which we were fortunate to win. And we did the Hungerford footbridges, which were finished in about 2002. And then since then, we've gone on to look at other river projects. So there's a ferry, an idea for a ferry across the river, working with the Hammersmith Bridge repairs, because they may well take a long time, so providing a temporary service. We're also lighting 14 bridges with the American artist Leo Villarreal. So those go from Tower Bridge all the way back to Albert Bridge, and lighting them with art. So it's a free public spectacle, and it does something we hope to generate excitement about the river at night. And then finally, and more recently, we've proposed a new crossing at the Thames Barrier. That would be a cycle and pedestrian crossing, which has many of the hallmarks of the Hungerford Bridge, so it takes us full circle. There were already piers in the river, the railway bridge piers in the river. That meant that any new structure could stand in the shadow of those piers, and so not present further obstructions to navigation. The same applies to the Thames Barrier. And we can get a very neat bridge that actually opens and closes with its feet standing in the shadow, as it were, in the lee of the bascules, the opening bascule structures of the barrier. So we're very excited about that. It means that it would be relatively affordable as bridges go, a mere 250 to 300 million pounds. But the technology required is relatively straightforward, because the spans would be very short. They'd be 60 meters to 30-meter opening leaves. And that's, domestic in bridge engineering terms. So that's very exciting, because it promotes cycling, which I know is a subject close to your heart, and walking. And it promotes a part of the city that is under provided in terms of crossings and in terms of public realm, the East End of London. And since the GLA is now moving to the docks there, we think it's a very appropriate time for the mayor to perhaps help with a little investment in that area in terms of infrastructure. But coming back to land, we're just finishing a really interesting long-term project in Mayfair, at the northwest corner of Hanover Square, where we've built, I think it's going to be the first building to be opened above Crossrail, an office building, next to it a grade 2-star building, which is being refurbished by our office, and then the whole of the northeast side of New Bond Street. So it's a complete city block, the whole northwest side of Hanover Square. And tied in with that, there are new routes, little alleyways and courtyards. There is, of course, new landscaping to the public realm. So a really exciting project in the heart of the West End. The thing about Hanover Square, and Paul Sandilands is my colleague, has been running that from the beginning, got the job and came up with the idea of moving the Crossrail station around, or the vent shafts around, so that we could actually work with our client, Great Portland Estates, and actually deliver something quite telling in that part of town. The thing about that project, which makes it slightly different from others, is it's not a single building or a collection of, object buildings. It's a sort of picturesque approach to how you enclose a square, how you create routes, and there's no single building there that you can actually walk around and say, well, that's an object, and I can see it. So it's a very, I find that a very interesting approach. It's more modest maybe than, here is an iconic building. And I hope, and I'm sure it will be a really great success in terms of permeability, in terms of regenerating a form of urban design, the square. This is the oldest square in Mayfair, I'm pretty sure, regenerating a piece of urban design that has been with us for 300 or 400 years. So we're very excited about that. We're still working with Barking Riverside Limited. The new railway is going to be finished, we think, next year. So that's the overground extension from Barking, and that means that place will start to really take off. We created a master plan for 11,000 homes, and those are steadily becoming available. There's several phases now nearing completion. Likewise at Kidbrooke, where we finished nearly 2,000 homes. We had, unfortunately, to knock down the old Ferrier estate, which was 1,920 homes. So we've only just got to the point where we've replaced those, but there's another 3,000 or so to come, and that's going full tilt at the moment. Other master planning and large-scale regeneration projects at Plumstead, also, and all over town. I think that's the exciting thing at the moment, is that local authorities are now taking the reins and actually providing homes themselves. So that's a new strand, working for local authorities directly. Again, another full circle, I suppose, back to the 1960s and 70s.
Now, you've long been interested in the idea of long life, loose fit, which at long last seems to be catching on, as because the London plan now is pushing the idea of the circular economy, and retrofit is really high on everyone's agenda. So it's one of the lessons perhaps we learned from the pandemic, is that buildings must be able to learn, and they have to adjust to new uses.
Yes, and you and I shared a very interesting phone interview with Stuart Brand, who wrote that book, How Buildings Learn, and who's an originator of, one of the originators of the concept of long life, loose fit, the other being Alex Gordon, who was an RIBA president in the early 1970s. And it would be so interesting to have his work published, republished, his papers on what was called long life, loose fit and low energy, very prescient, extraordinarily prescient. And the reason I became interested in that is because I'm actually not an architect. I studied architecture. I got my RIBA part 1 and 2, but never took my part 3. So I'm not technically an architect, but I studied social sciences before I came to architecture. And I was really excited by the idea that architecture could provide for what I could see was very rapid social change. And And the paradox was that the more radical and modern and sort of interesting looking the buildings were, in some ways, the less flexible they were, the less they accommodated social change. As you're referring to, there's no greater period of social change post-war, really, than now with COVID and with the epidemic and people living and working much more from home. So that's a fascination, is, well, how do buildings, how does architecture enfranchise, empower people rather than trap them in structures that don't allow them to alter their behavior?
So you mentioned working on the South Bank, and that's been a key project really for the practice, hasn't it, for almost a quarter of a century. So one of the things about that was you had to work very closely with the local community. So as community engagement becomes more and more important, goes to the top of a lot of developers' agenda, what are the key lessons that you've learned about engaging with local people on the South Bank?
Well, it's a very unique community there. It was a community that came out of turmoil and I suppose resistance to development. The local community was anxious about top-down development, which they saw as taking away homes and their sort of familiar environment. We started working there actually more than a quarter of a century ago. It was the late 80s, so it's sort of 32 years, 33 years. They were campaigning, they went from opposition to campaigning for homes, affordable homes, and for jobs, and jobs that they could pick up. And many of them were from skilled working class jobs, so printing, the printing industry particularly, which was declining at the time. And so we were fortunate, we won a competition to design the refurbishment of the OXO building. And so our very first experience with a big client, that was really our first job, big job, was with a client that was the community. So it became sort of second nature that you would understand, you know, that client's needs, just as you would understand the client if it was a bank or you know, or some kind of sports complex. You know, it was the community that was trying to rebuild the OXO Tower. And we then went on and have built or delivered, I don't know, 20 projects in that area. And that's extraordinarily rewarding, I hope for them as well, but certainly for us, because, you know, it's just very unusual to be able to plan and deliver projects with the local community serially. And our latest project is perhaps the most exciting, or you know, as exciting as any, which is a new swimming pool and sports centre behind the National Theatre, and that will be funded by a very tall building, a 43-storey tower. So we've gone from homes for the local people, which when they first started were 2 or 3 stories, and we've built some of those as well at Broadwall, which is a street in the middle of their site. But now we're building 43-storey buildings for the same client, for the same community. So, you know, we have moved our thinking forward, but crikey, they've moved it even further forward. And it just shows you that, you know, the imagination of local people, when they're led really well and when they're organized well, is as fertile and as exciting as any, you know, single patron client that you could imagine.
Yes, well, that's very encouraging as we look to changes in the way the government wants to deliver a planning system which relies on local people having a say in terms of how we characterize areas and how we utilize codes to design new housing and new environments. So, Alex, thank you very much for your insights and telling us about your practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.